If you want to turn to 1 Peter 2, that's where we're going to be for the majority of this lesson, 1 Peter 2. But before we get there, I want you to think about a few questions. If you had to narrow it down to just a few words, what would you say that our purpose as the church is? We've talked a lot together about how the church benefits us. We've talked a lot about how we are encouraged and strengthened by being together, and that is certainly true. But what is the church supposed to do out in the world? What is our relationship with those outside of these doors supposed to look like? 1 Peter 2 gives us one answer to that. 1 Peter 2 is going to talk a lot about our purpose as Christians. What God has done in our lives. What He has freed us to do. And by extension, the way that we are to live to mirror the blessings that God has given us. He's going to give us some tangible examples of how our purpose impacts and has to impact the way that we live, how our purpose guides our lives. So we're going to look together about the calling of God in 1 Peter 2 and how we can live into that calling. Drew, where's my clicker? Drew Parsons, do you still have? Oh, it's up here? Okay. There you go. Growing together in purpose. That's what we're going to be looking at this morning. So just to give a little context, Peter opened this letter in chapter 1 by talking about some of the concepts that we've been talking about a lot recently of hope and holiness, about staying rooted in the Word that God has given us, and using that to help us live with an eternal perspective. And we're going to see some of those concepts sort of expounded upon in this passage as we talk about how that hope and holiness determines the way we live. So if you're in 1 Peter 2 with me, we're just going to start by reading verses 1 through 10. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, desire the pure milk of the Word, so that by it you may grow up into your salvation. If you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to Him, a living stone, rejected by people, but chosen and honored by God, you yourselves, as living stones, a spiritual house, are being built to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For as it says in Scripture, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and honored cornerstone, and the one who believes in Him will never be put to shame." So honor will come to you who believe, but for the unbelieving, the stone that the builders rejected, this one has become the chief cornerstone, and a stone to stumble over, and a rock to trip over. They stumble because they disobey the word, and they were destined to do so. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His possession, so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So in the first 3 verses here, Peter sort of starts with some of the applications. He says, if you have tasted that the Lord is good, in verse 3. He said, if you've tasted that the Lord is good, here's what you're going to do with it. So Peter's sort of starting with the assumption here that we are Christians. We've already seen the goodness of God. We've seen the blessings that He has for our life in Jesus. We've come to Him for life and salvation. And the picture that Peter is sort of painting here is that we are just so amazed with the goodness of God. We are so in awe of His blessings that we're just sitting asking ourselves, how can I possibly pay him back? How can I possibly show him just a small amount of the love that he has shown to me? And Peter says, here's some of the ways that you can do that. And notice what he says here. The natural conclusion, if you have seen God and you have understood the blessings that he has given you, here's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to get rid of all of our pride, all of our selfishness, all of our greed. And we're going to replace it with Jesus. The idea here is, Peter says, there's some things that got to go. If you truly love God and you truly understand what he's done for you, some things have to be removed from your life. There's no place for a selfish life in the life of a Christian. For those who love God and want to follow him, if you truly understand who God is and what he's done in your life, you're going to want to get rid of all pride. And you're going to want to replace it with spiritual milk. You're going to want to replace it with the blessings from God, the Word itself that we can grow in together to come to a greater knowledge of God. What Peter wants us to see here in these first 3 verses is that if we truly understand the amazing blessings of God, we're going to desire to have ourselves decrease so that he can increase in our lives. We're going to want to grow in him. And Peter really continues that idea of the goodness of God in these next set of verses, 4 through 8. Look again at what Peter is saying. Here is the goodness of God. That God sent Jesus for us. And Jesus experienced rejection. Jesus experienced shame and death. He references Psalm 118, the famous passage about Jesus being the rejected cornerstone. But he did all of that for us. He was rejected and experienced shame and death so that we could leave our shame and death of sin and experience his glory. Peter says here, it's all God's doing. It is God's grace. It is God's mercy, God's gift of Jesus' sacrifice. But notice what Peter does with that picture. He says, you know what you do with a cornerstone? You build off of it. And that's exactly what we are to do here, to build off of the amazing gift that God has given us in Jesus. And here's the first clear picture we get of the church here. We are a people who are built on Jesus, the chief cornerstone. We've seen Jesus. We've believed in him. We've tasted the goodness of his blessings, and we've committed our lives to him. And so, God has taken us. Though we're all from different backgrounds, we all have different strengths and different weaknesses, though we all were living in shame and death, he has taken all of us, and through Jesus, he has made us a house, a temple dedicated to him, built on the Lord Jesus, the chief cornerstone. And Peter says God's not going to allow that temple to be shaken. That temple is not going to get torn down. It's amazing, the picture here. If you believe in Jesus, if you choose to base your life on him, Peter says you will not be put to shame. And that goes both individually and collectively as a church. If we are people whose lives are built on Jesus, we're going to be just fine. He's going to share his honor and his life with us. We just have to keep building on the true foundation. So that's the principle that through God's grace and Jesus' sacrifice, we've all been built into a holy temple to him. But what do we do with that? And Peter really continues to hammer on that point in verses 9 through 10. Look at what Peter compares us to. A chosen people, a holy nation, God's own people. This looks a lot like, and it's supposed to look a lot like, Israel's role as God's chosen people in the Old Testament. A nation of royal priests, following after our King, the high priest Jesus. It reminds me some of Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. The people here are before Mount Sinai, and they're getting the law delivered to them, and we get the first real peek into a priesthood, because up to this point, we haven't seen the Levitical priesthood as we know it from the Old Testament, and this is what God says to Moses in Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, this you shall say to the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to Israel." So see what God is saying here to Israel. You've seen my goodness. You've seen my deliverance. You've seen my salvation. That's very similar to what Peter just said to us. You've seen the goodness of God. And so, God is offering through His covenant with Israel, if you'll stick with me, if you'll obey me, if you'll build your lives on me, here's what I'll do for you. I will be your God, and you will be my people. You will be, out of all the earth, you will be my treasured possession. You will be a kingdom of priests serving me. God looked at Israel and He says, "I've chosen you. And if you'll build your life on me, we will have this beautiful, special bond." And yet we know that Israel never truly did that. That was Exodus 19, but in Exodus 20, just a chapter later, Israel tells Moses, "Hey, can you make it to where God doesn't speak directly to us anymore? We're too scared of Him. We don't really want to have anything to do with Him in that close of a way." They distanced themselves from God. And then repeatedly through sin and rejection and doubt and complaining, they go further and further and further from God until by the time you get to the end of the Old Testament, they are not God's people at all anymore. In fact, they're worse than all the pagan nations that came before them. Israel wanted no part of being a kingdom of priests to God. They didn't want that closeness. But here, Peter picks up on that same promise, that same idea, and he says, today the church, believers, can be His holy nation in the world today. We can be His priests, serving Him in the world. We can build our lives on Him. And when we do that, we can fulfill that promise of a chosen people, a special possession to God. We will be His people, and He will be our God. We'll have that close bond that God has always desired to have with His people. And in that relationship, as we're growing in His truth and we're learning to live in His character, we're going to start living out His love, living out His mercy and grace. We're going to serve those who can't serve us. We'll forgive those who have wronged us. We'll encourage the weak. We'll care about justice. We'll love our enemies. We'll start living out those first 3 verses of this chapter. We'll start serving God so that in ourselves there's less and less of our pride, less and less of the world, and more of God's perfect character. Peter's point here is when you have seen Jesus and when you've understood what He's done for you on the cross, you will desire to follow in His path. Not begrudgingly because you have to, but because you want to. You'll want to draw near to God. You'll want to show Him that you love Him, and you'll want to make that love manifest by keeping His commandments. You'll put away yourself, you'll put away your pride and your selfishness, and you'll replace it with His love. What Peter says is our purpose as Christians is to be holy as our God is holy. To build our lives around His love and His truth. And now Peter's going to give us a few ways that we can do that, a few ways that we can live as a priesthood to God. And it really adds to exactly what we just talked about. Look in verses 11 and 12 here. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So again, there's an urging here from Peter, just like verses 1 through 3. Stay away from evil. But here, Peter really puts it in perspective. Now we have the big picture. Peter just told us a life of the world, a life rejecting Jesus leads to shame, but a life founded on the cornerstone can only bring honor. A life in the temple of God as a holy priest leads to glory and life. And it's the same way here. Stay away from the evil things of the world because it's going to bring shame. Live in purity and righteousness because it's going to bring honor. But look at the point here. This time it's not about us. Peter is saying this is outward focused. We are called to live in an intentional, righteous way so that we can serve as examples in the world. Here Peter talks about Gentiles. That's the nations. Those who do not know God. For us, we would say the world. And Peter says they're going to see our conduct. And it's going to have an effect on them. It may be positive, it may be negative, but it's going to have an effect. This looks a lot like Israel's role again as God's chosen people, where they, in Isaiah 49 verse 6, they and the Messiah that is to come from them were said to be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the nations unto salvation. And that's the same thing that Peter's drawing on here. Our calling is that when we've believed in Him, we've seen the beauties of His path, we're called to live in a way so that others will see the light of God reflected in us. Because it's God is the one who has the light of salvation. He is the light. And yet what Peter tells us here is that when we live as priests, when we live by getting the grossness of the world out of us and replacing it with the love and character of God, people are going to notice that. And even if they don't know anything about Jesus, even if they don't care anything about Jesus, even if they're evildoers, as Peter says here, they're going to say, something's different about those people. And that's a good different. And they're going to come to glorify God through our example. God calls us to serve as a visible evidence of His love and of His blessings. That others can see Him in the way that we live. They're going to see the path of the church. They're going to see the way we love each other. They're going to see the service. They're going to see the humility. And they're going to say, I need that in my life. They might not know anything about God, but they're going to look at the path of Jesus and they're going to say, that is the better way. Peter says here, if we live holy, like priests are called to do, if we live in God's path, people are that's going to change hearts. It's evangelism by example. Peter's point really here is the church's purpose in the world is evangelism. And this is evangelism, like I just said, by example, that all of our purpose collectively as the church in the world is to shine the light of Jesus by the way we live. That we can show people that there is a better path by showing them God's grace and mercy in our lives. That we're living and saying, look at what God's grace and mercy can do in a broken life. Because look at what it's done in my life. And if it can do it in my life, He will do it in yours. Peter says our job here as priests is to serve God and to serve others, to love God and love others in a way, to live in a righteous manner in a way that others will want to come to know the love of God. That our lives, our righteousness is visible not to glorify ourselves, but to glorify the God who sent us. Peter lays out here, there are consequences for our actions. If we act dishonorably, if we act like the world, if we act in pride and selfishness and greed, we're going to reap dishonor and shame for ourselves, for the church, and to some extent, before the world anyway, before God. But if we get rid of our pride and replace it with the character of God's love and God's light, just like Peter told us to do all the way back in the first 3 verses, we can glorify God in our lives. And people are going to see God's light reflected in us, and they'll seek to glorify God too. And so we live so that other people can see the love and light of God reflected in what we do here. It's the beauty of God's plan that He has made us a part of something so much greater than ourselves. He has made us from not a people, and He's made us into His holy people, priests, who even though we are all broken, we can reflect His love into the world. We can be examples for others. It's amazing. And that's what Peter builds on in the last few verses that we're going to look at today. He said, here's another way you can be lights to the nations, and that's to change how we speak, to change how we show honor. Start again in verse 13 with me. Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or the governor as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So Peter says to show honor here to everyone, especially those in authority. And this may seem a little out of left field. How does this connect to what we just talked about? And I want you to remember, what we're focusing on here is us living our lives in a way that shines God's light into the outside world. And Peter is saying one way that we can do this is by living in an honorable manner through the world, in the world. Peter's saying Christians cannot under any circumstances be disrespectful people. Christians are not the type of people that should be known for talking badly about their boss, because the world's going to see that, and it's going to reflect on our faith, and it's going to reflect on the church. Peter's saying here, Christians shouldn't be the kind of people who are known for deprecating politicians and leaders, because that's going to have consequences. That's going to reflect on the faith that we represent. Peter says every human institution, that's your school, your work, your government, whatever it is, the idea is that Christians show respect no matter who it is. Peter says Christians are the kind of neighbors you want to have. Christians are the kind of people you want to be around. They are selfless, serving, humble, respectful. And this is going to manifest in every aspect of their life. Because Christians cannot be troublemakers and argument starters. Let me tell you one aside here that I find very important. Sometimes I get the mindset, well, I'll respect so-and-so when they've earned my respect. I'll respect my boss, I'll respect this politician, I'll respect the teacher, whoever it is, when they have earned my respect. Peter says, no, sorry, that's not good enough. That is not respecting every human institution. Because Peter says this isn't for their sake. Notice again, Peter says, respect every human institution for the Lord's sake. We're doing this for God, And I want you to think of it this way. When Peter's talking about honoring and respecting the government here, he's talking about the emperor. The emperors are bad guys. Emperors were persecutors. Emperors were oppressive. They were violent. Emperors were people who oftentimes set themselves up as gods. They were blasphemers and just about every other bad thing you could possibly think of. And Peter says, for the Lord's sake, honor even them. So tell me what excuse we have in our lives to not show honor to the human institutions before us. And I'm going to say, if setting yourself up as a god doesn't make the cut for not being worthy of having honor shown before you, I don't think there is a case. The emperors deserved no honor. And yet Peter said, for Jesus' sake, show them honor. Don't be a troublemaker. Don't be a disrespectful person. This is the will of God. Christians have to be respectful because the kind of disrespect that we can show before the world has consequences. People are going to see it and they're going to remember. And if people know Christians as those who are disrespectful, they're rude, they're complaining, what are people going to think about the faith we represent? And let me tell you, you can see that in the world right now. Because people think of Christians as rude, angry, argumentative people. And in a lot of ways, we've earned that reputation. The message of Peter here is Christians must be honorable, they must show honor, and they must respect. Notice what Peter ends this section with. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. That doesn't leave a lot of people that we don't have to love and serve. That just about covers all the bases. Peter says, serve God, respect your leaders, respect everyone, and show love to the church. Peter says we're free, yes, but it's not the kind of freedom that lets us live however we want to. It's not doing whatever's right in our own eyes. We're free from sin to shine the light of God into the world. And we do that by getting rid of all the impurity, getting rid of the world, getting rid of selfishness and pride, and replacing it with love, service, honor, and righteousness. That's the message of 1 Peter 2. And I'll spend just a few seconds applying that to our lives. God has made us a part of something so much greater than ourselves. I want you to appreciate that. Through Jesus, though we all have been sinners, though we all are broken people, God has made it to where you are a blessing to those around you. That you are useful to God because He has taken us and made us a part of something where we can show His love and His light to the world. You are built into the temple of the living God. You are a priest of Him serving under our high priest Jesus. You have a purpose. And that is a beautiful thing. And the message of 1 Peter 2 is do not neglect that purpose. Embrace it. Live in a way that shows honor. Live in a way that shows service. Live in a way that shows love. So that the world, whether they care about Jesus or not, whether they're awful like the emperors were, whether they're just the worst of the worst, that they will look into the path of the church and they're going to see there's something different about those people. Peter is saying there is no such thing as a stagnant Christianity, because a stagnant Christianity is no Christianity at all. Because we have a calling to unite, both with God and the church worldwide, to shine the light of Jesus to everyone we meet. you realize how incredible that is? Peter says when we come to God, we see the gift of Jesus and we choose to believe in Him as our Lord, we get to be tools of His glory. So let's get to work. Let's grow into our purpose together. We have seen the goodness of God. We have seen the beauty of the rejected cornerstone, and now we have to live like it. The call here, remember your purpose. We must decrease so God can increase in us. And when we do that, God will bless us greatly. God will bless our work. And God will let us be lights for Him. So that's the invitation. Get rid of the world in your life. Get rid of the pride. Get rid of the selfishness. And replace it with God's love and righteousness. If you're not a Christian, that means coming to Him, repenting of your sins, joining Him in the waters of baptism and saying, I want that in my life. I want God's love in my life. I want to show the light of God in who I am. For a lot of us who have accepted Jesus, are you living up to your purpose? When you look in the mirror, do you see I'm shining the light of God in the way I live? Because if not, it's the beautiful path. It is hard work, but it is absolutely worth it. And let's do whatever we can to get back on that path. Whether that's coming to Him in prayer, whether that's finding those here that can help you and encourage and strengthen you, whatever we can do, feel free to come to the front as we stand and as we sing.